They hired me to fix a derelict ship. Only later did I learn it belonged to an alien queen. The call came through on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious, because nothing good ever happened to me on a Tuesday. I was sitting in my workshop on Relay Station Vorta 9, eating cold noodles out of a tin and watching a pressure gauge on the wall tick up toward yellow. The gauge belonged to a secondary coolant loop I'd been meaning to repair for 6 weeks. The noodles belonged to whoever had left them in the communal refrigerator, but they'd been there long enough that I'd decided they were mine by rights of abandonment. The comm blinked orange, not the standard white of a maintenance ticket. Orange. Priority. Marin Kass. The voice on the other end belonged to a galactic cooperative liaison officer. I could tell by the clipped, overly enunciated standard they all used, like they were reading from a script for beings who'd only just learned the language. You are certified for Grade 7 hull integrity work. Grade 7 and 8, I said. Also licensed for biocontainment systems, atmospheric regulation, and 3 classes of drive architecture. You want to tell me what this is about? There was a pause, a long one, long enough that I put down the noodles. We have a contract, salvage and repair assessment. The vessel in question is currently drifting in Sector 14, approximately 40 hours from your position. The compensation is another pause. When they said the number, I sat up straight. Contingent on full assessment and preliminary repairs completed within a 30-day window. I did the math. The number they said would cover 14 months of workshop rental, parts costs for the coolant loop, a new atmospheric recycler for my own ship, and a modest but dignified amount of food that was actually mine. What's wrong with it? I asked. That, the liaison said carefully, is what we're hiring you to determine. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. But the gauge on the wall had ticked into yellow while we were talking, and the noodles had gone cold, and 14 months of financial security has a way of shutting down the part of the brain that asks sensible things. Send me the coordinates, I said. My ship was a Talbot-class medium hauler called the Incident Report, named that by the previous owner as either a joke or a warning. She was old enough that her hull plating had that particular matte finish that came from too many patch jobs, a ship that had been repaired so many times in so many different ways that she looked like a quilt from the outside. I loved her. She was honest about her age. The 40-hour transit gave me time to review what little the cooperative had sent over. It wasn't much. The target vessel had been detected by a long-range survey drone 3 weeks earlier, drifting without power in the outermost band of the sector. No transponder signal, no emergency beacon, no response to hails on any frequency. The survey drone had noted hull dimensions consistent with a Class IV heavy transport, but the configuration didn't match anything in the cooperative's registry. That last part was the thing I kept coming back to. The cooperative's registry was enormous. It covered the vessels of 47 recognized species and 300 years of documented spaceflight. If a ship wasn't in it, the ship was either very new, very old, or very deliberately absent. I cross-referenced the hull dimensions against what I could access through my own databases. 15 years of repair work leaves you with a lot of reference material, and found nothing, not even a near match. The proportions were wrong for any architecture I'd encountered, and I'd encountered most of them. Too wide amidships. Too shallow a keel profile. Drive housing at the aft positioned in a configuration I didn't recognize. I pulled up the drone footage and watched it 3 times. The ship floated against the stars without moving, without lights, without any sign that it had ever been inhabited. There was something about the way it drifted. Not the random tumble of dead hardware, but a very slow, very deliberate rotation, like something breathing in its sleep. I told myself that was fanciful. I spent the last 6 hours of transit doing equipment checks. I had a full repair kit, obviously, plasma cutters, seal patch compounds, atmospheric analyzers, structural foam, 3 different flavors of sealant rated for vacuum exposure. I had a biocontainment suit that I'd never actually needed to use, but carried everywhere since the incident on Hecla Station that I didn't talk about. I had a sidearm that I was technically licensed to carry and practically terrible at using. I also had, jammed into a pocket of my kit bag, a small paper crane my daughter had folded for me the last time I'd been planetside. She'd been 6, and she'd been very serious about it, explaining each fold with the gravity of someone sharing a secret. I kept it because it was good luck, or because I was sentimental. Both were true, and I saw no reason to distinguish between them. The ship came into visual range with 4 hours still on the transit clock, which meant it was much larger than the drone footage had suggested. I stopped eating the ration bar I'd been working through and just looked. She was beautiful was the first thought, not the beauty of design. There was nothing graceful about her lines, nothing that suggested any particular aesthetic intention. She was beautiful the way a cliff face is beautiful, or a storm front, or any large natural thing that simply exists at a scale that makes you aware of your own smallness. The hull was dark, a deep gray-black that caught the starlight at odd angles, giving it the quality of something carved from a single piece of material rather than assembled. The plating was in large, irregular sections like scales, not the smooth integrated panels of cooperative engineering, more organic, more grown. I understood then why the registry had no match. This wasn't a ship someone had built. This was a ship that had been made the way a shell is made, accreted layer by layer around something living. My hand moved toward the comm to call the liaison and ask the questions I hadn't asked. Then I thought about 14 months of financial security, and I moved my hand back to the navigation panel. Incident report docking approach, I said to no one, which was a habit I'd developed from too many years of solo work. Vessel is unresponsive, initiating passive scan. The scan took 20 minutes. What it found made me sit very still for another 10. The hull was structurally compromised at 3 points, significant breaches, not small fractures. The drive section was cold, no residual heat signatures, completely dead. But the interior of the ship was not dead. The passive scan picked up heat signatures in a distributed pattern across what appeared to be the central third of the vessel, not the concentrated heat of a running reactor. Something diffuse, something metabolic. The ship was warm from the inside the way a sleeping animal is warm. They didn't tell me it was a bioship, I said to the empty cockpit. Then I put on my suit, picked up my kit, and went aboard anyway. The docking collar at the aft section was the one piece of the ship that had a recognizable configuration, a universal hard dock fitting, which told me she'd been designed to interface with cooperative infrastructure at some point, or that whoever built her had anticipated needing to. It engaged without difficulty. The airlock beyond it was sealed, but the manual override was in a position that made intuitive sense, which was the first genuinely reassuring thing I'd encountered. The interior air was breathable. My analyzer confirmed it within the first 30 seconds. Oxygen-nitrogen mix, slightly elevated CO2, temperature 11 degrees Celsius. Cold but workable. The lighting was emergency tier only, a dim reddish glow from strips along the base of the corridor walls, the kind of illumination that existed to keep people from walking into things rather than to actually help them see. The corridors were wide, wider than they needed to be for any crew I could imagine, even accounting for species with bulk or unusual configurations. The ceiling was high. The walls curved inward at the top, giving the passage a vaulted quality, like being inside a cathedral or a ribcage. I kept that second image out of my mind as best I could. My footsteps were very loud. There were no other sounds. I did what I was hired to do. I started with the drive section and worked forward, documenting everything, taking readings, noting faults. The drives were dead in the way that power cells die when drained completely, not burned out, not damaged, simply empty. The conduit architecture was unlike anything I'd encountered, but the underlying principles were recognizable. Energy in, conversion, thrust. The same problem solved a different way. I could work with that. The hull breaches were at the aft quarter, the port midsection, and one near the bow that I had to squeeze through two collapsed corridors to reach. All three had the character of damage sustained from outside, impacts, not internal failures. Something had hit this ship, something with considerable force repeatedly and from multiple vectors. I was photographing the bow breach when I found the first of the glyphs. They covered a section of inner hull about 3 meters wide, not carved into the surface, but formed by a slight variation in the material itself, the way certain metals can be shaped to carry patterns without any external tooling. They were dense and precise and absolutely incomprehensible to me in terms of language, but the layout, the spatial relationship between symbols, the repetition patterns, the way certain clusters appeared to reference other clusters, had a quality I recognized. Not the content, the architecture of how information was organized. I took photographs for 40 minutes. Then I sat on the cold deck with my back against the wall and looked at them until my eyes ached. I pulled the paper crane out of my kit bag pocket without quite knowing why, turned it over in my fingers, thought about my daughter's serious face explaining each fold, thought about how information can be stored in the relationship between things rather than in the things themselves. How a flat sheet becomes a bird not through any change in what the paper is, but through the record of every fold applied to it. The glyphs weren't text, they were a map or a manual or both. Okay, I said to the empty corridor, okay. I'd been aboard 6 hours when I found the chamber. I hadn't been looking for it. I'd been following the main structural spine of the ship toward what my scan data suggested was the primary power node, the place where all the ship's energy distribution seemed to originate. The corridor narrowed, then widened suddenly into a space too large to be anything functional in the ordinary sense. It was circular, domed, and the walls were not walls in any traditional sense. They were translucent. Not glass, not any polymer I recognized. Something that had the quality of a very deep body of water seen from above. Dark but not entirely opaque, with something moving very slowly in the depths. The floor was clear. I could see down through it, maybe 5 meters, into a space filled with the same translucent material arranged in concentric rings, and at the center of each ring. I stopped, I counted them. 47. 47 roughly ovoid structures, each approximately 3 meters long, suspended in the translucent medium with the particular weightless quality of things that had been suspended for a very long time. Each one was sealed. Each one had the faint, diffuse warmth that my scanner had been detecting since I arrived. They were occupied. I did not panic. I am a professional and I have been inside a lot of strange ships, and I have found a lot of strange things inside those ships, and panic has never once made any of those situations better. What I did was stand very still and take readings for 4 full minutes, and then I sat down on the floor, the clear floor, which I tried not to think too hard about, and reviewed what the readings told me. The occupants were alive, deeply dormant, metabolic rates so low that my scanner initially read them as mechanical, but alive. The life sign profiles were not any species I had in my database, but they had the fundamental architecture of complex organisms, cardiac analogs, respiratory cycles, neural patterns in a maintenance loop. 47 beings in suspended animation. In a ship that had been struck by something, stripped of power and set to drift. They didn't tell me it was a sleeper ship, I said. My voice sounded very small in that chamber. I stayed with them for a long time, not because there was anything useful I could do in that moment. There wasn't, not yet, but because leaving felt wrong. They were alive and alone and had been drifting for an unknown period of time, and the least I could do was be present for a few minutes before I went to do the work of trying to help them. I looked at the closest pod through the floor. I couldn't make out anything distinct through the medium and the distance, but the shape within was large, larger than I'd estimated from the outside measurements, much larger than a human, certainly, larger than most things I knew. I put the paper crane back in my pocket and went to find the power node. The liaison called while I was elbow-deep in a conduit array in the power section, which was the worst possible time. "Initial assessment," he asked. 3 hull breaches, repairable with my current equipment, though the bow breach will take time because of the collapsed corridors. Drives are drained, not damaged. I can work with the architecture even though it's unfamiliar. Power distribution is complex but coherent. I paused, deciding how to phrase the next part. There are 47 life pods in the central chamber, occupied, all vital signs present. The silence that followed was longer than any previous silence. "That information," the liaison said slowly, "was not in our initial assessment." "No," I said, "it wasn't. We'll need to, there are protocols for." More silence. I had the distinct impression of bureaucratic machinery engaging on the other end of the call, of committees being convened, and frameworks being consulted, and the weight of institutional process settling over a situation that needed speed. I knew that sound. I'd heard it my whole career. I'd heard it in every emergency I'd ever worked, the grinding of official structures trying to metabolize something they hadn't anticipated. "How long," I asked carefully, "before the protocols produce an actionable response?" "We'll convene an emergency assessment panel." "How long?" Another silence. 3 to 5 days for initial convening, possibly longer if jurisdictional questions arise regarding. I disconnected. I sat back on my heels and looked at the power node in front of me. Then I looked at the data I'd gathered on the ship systems. Then I thought about 47 beings in stasis pods in a powerless ship with damaged hull integrity drifting in deep space. 3 to 5 days, possibly longer. "Right," I said, "right." I got back to work. The power systems were the key. Without power, the stasis pods would maintain for approximately another 8 to 12 days on their reserve capacity. I'd calculated that from the drain rates I could measure. With power restored to even 30% of nominal levels, they'd be stable for months. The problem was that the drive architecture was completely alien, and alien in a way that suggested the people who'd built this ship had solved the problem of energy generation in a fundamentally different way than anyone in the cooperative registry had. I spent 16 hours on it. I slept for 4, ate twice, and spent the rest of the time with the glyph photographs spread across my workstation screen and my engineering references open beside them. The glyphs were a maintenance manual. I'd been right about that at least. The organizational architecture was the same one I'd recognized. Clusters referenced other clusters the way technical documentation references itself. A system of cross-reference and specification that was language-independent in its deep structure. Because engineering has to work in the real world and the real world doesn't care about language. I couldn't read the symbols, but I could read the relationships, the repetitions, the hierarchies. Where a cluster appeared consistently before certain other clusters, it was a precondition. Where 2 clusters always appeared together, they were a system. Where a single symbol appeared in every cluster, it was fundamental. It took me 6 hours to build a working vocabulary of 43 functional relationships. It took me another 6 to map those relationships onto the actual hardware in front of me. It wasn't their power system. Not exactly. What it was a translation layer, an interface between the ship's native energy architecture and a secondary system that could be fed by external sources. Someone had built this ship to be refueled from the outside, built it, and then documented how to do it in a way that didn't require you to speak their language, only to understand the structure of the problem. Whoever designed this ship had planned for the possibility that someone else might need to fix it. I found that thought very moving in the middle of a 16-hour engineering problem, which was probably a sign of how tired I was. I ran 3 power conduits from the incident report's own reactors through the docking collar and into the translation layer. It was not elegant. I used 3 different grades of coupling that weren't rated for each other and 2 lengths of emergency conduit that I wrapped in insulating mesh to stop the junction points from shorting. My engineering professors would have wept. But engineering in the field is not about elegance. It is about getting from the problem to the solution by the most direct route available with the materials at hand, and the materials at hand were what they were. I pressurized the system at 10% capacity to test the translation layer. The lights came on. Not the emergency strips. Full lighting, warm, even, distributed through what I realized now were luminescent elements embedded in the hull material itself, the whole structure glowing softly from within. The corridors transformed. The vaulted passages that had been oppressive in the dark became something else entirely, deliberate, designed, considered. The hull material at the ceiling caught the light and scattered it in patterns that moved slowly like clouds or like water. I stood in the corridor outside the power section and felt the ship breathe. That wasn't fanciful this time, it was literal. With power restored, a circulatory system I hadn't identified in my assessment came online, a slow, rhythmic movement of fluid through conduits just beneath the hull's surface, a thermal regulation system that worked the same way a body works, distributing warmth from the core to the extremities. The ship had been cold. Now it was becoming warm. "There you are," I said. I spent the next 4 days doing what I'd been hired to do, repairing the hull breaches. The work was physical and absorbing and required all of my attention, which was helpful because when I wasn't working I was sitting in the central chamber looking through the floor at 47 occupied pods and feeling the weight of something I didn't have a name for yet. The liaison called again on day 3. There had been a jurisdictional question. They were working through it. The assessment panel had been expanded to include 3 additional bodies. He would keep me updated. "Are the life signs stable?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "for now." I didn't tell him about the power conduits I'd run from my own ship. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I was, because if I told him, there would be more panels, more process, more frameworks being consulted. Because the moment I introduced that information into the official process, it would stop being engineering and start being policy, and policy moved at its own speed regardless of what was happening to 47 sleeping beings in a damaged ship. On day 4, while I was sealing the last section of the bow breach, I felt the ship shudder. Not the shudder of structural failure. I'd felt enough of those to know the difference. This was something else. A vibration that moved through the hull material in a wave pattern, starting from somewhere forward and propagating aft. A long, slow, resonant tremor, like a very deep sound, too low for me to hear with my ears, felt instead through the soles of my feet and the palms of my hands where they rested against the hull. I sealed my faceplate and ran. The central chamber had changed. The translucent medium in the floor had brightened, not dramatically, but noticeably, the darkness of a deep body of water shifting toward the quality of shallower water with sunlight penetrating it. And the pods that had been static for the entire time I'd been aboard, were moving. Very slightly, very slowly, a motion at the threshold of perception, the kind you weren't sure you were seeing until you'd watched for a full minute and verified that, yes, the position had changed. The outermost ring was rotating counterclockwise at approximately 1 centimeter per minute. The innermost ring was rotating clockwise. They were cycling. They were cycling the way the contents of a chamber cycle when conditions change, when temperature rises, when chemical gradients shift, when the environment signals that it is time. My power conduits had done this. Restoring the ship systems had triggered something in the stasis architecture that I had not anticipated, because I hadn't understood what I was restoring. The pods were waking up. I stood at the edge of the chamber and ran the math. My power feed could sustain the ship at about 30% of its apparent nominal capacity. Whether that was enough to complete whatever process had begun, I didn't know. Whether it was safe to interrupt the process once started, I didn't know. Whether the beings in those pods were going to emerge in a state that would be amenable to finding a lone human engineer standing in their ship, uninvited, having repaired it without authorization from anyone on either side of the transaction. I ran the numbers again. 8 to 12 days of reserve stasis capacity I'd estimated before my power feed arrived. That was a week ago. Without the feed, they would have had 4 to 5 days remaining. Even with the feed, if the waking cycle had begun drawing heavily on the reserves. I called the liaison. "I need the fastest available vessel in Sector 14, I said when he answered. "With full diplomatic, medical, and first contact capability. I need it here in less than 40 hours. The panel hasn't yet reached The occupants are waking up," I said. "The process has begun. If you don't have someone here who can speak to them when they emerge, you're going to have 47 beings who just woke up in a damaged ship after an unknown period of drifting, with a human stranger standing in their central chamber." A silence. "We'll dispatch immediately," he said. I had 39 hours before anyone official arrived, and I spent most of them in the central chamber. Not doing anything in particular, the process once begun didn't seem to require my intervention. The pods cycled slowly through their rotation. The medium grew gradually warmer and clearer. The ship's own systems, drawing on my power feed, were managing the process. I was not necessary. But I stayed anyway. I was sitting with my back against the curved wall, reviewing my documentation for the 4th time, when the outermost pod shifted noticeably. Not the slow drift of the rotation cycle, but a distinct, deliberate movement. A repositioning, and then, very slightly, it opened. Not fully. A seam appeared along the upper surface, a line of separation in the material, and from that line rose a fine vapor, temperature differential meeting the chamber air, and the material peeled back in a way that reminded me of nothing so much as a flower opening, if flowers were made of something denser and stranger than petals. The being inside was large. I had estimated large from the pod dimensions. I had prepared myself for large. What I had not adequately prepared for was the quality of large, not the bulk of something simply massive, but the proportionality of a creature engineered by whatever process had produced this ship to occupy exactly the scale it occupied, with the particular rightness of something that belonged to its size. She, and I thought of her as she, though I could not have said why, only that it felt accurate in the way that some instincts are accurate, uncurled slowly in the opening pod, limbs extending in sequence with the unhurried deliberateness of something that had all the time in the world. Her eyes opened. They were a dark amber gold, large, set in a face that was not remotely human, but which had the quality that I associated with intelligence. Not the intelligence of computation or reaction, but the intelligence of someone who has been thinking for a very long time about things of consequence. She looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us moved for a long moment. Then she made a sound, not language, not yet. Something lower than language, a resonant exhalation that the ship seemed to receive, the hull material vibrating faintly in response. A sound that said, in no language I spoke, "I am here. I am awake. I am aware." I reached into my kit bag and pulled out the paper crane. I don't know why I did it. Instinct, maybe, or the particular kind of social desperation that emerges when you are alone with someone you cannot speak to and you need to signal that you mean no harm. I held it up, turning it so she could see it. The small folded bird, white against the warm light of the restored chamber. She watched it for a long time. Her amber eyes moved from the crane to me and back to the crane. Then one of her hands, four-fingered, proportioned differently from mine but unmistakably a hand, a thing made for holding and manipulating, extended slowly toward it. I set it on the floor between us. She studied it for several minutes without touching it. Then she looked at me again. Then, with a precision that I would not have thought possible for fingers of that configuration, she picked it up and turned it over once, examining the folds, the way each crease gave rise to the next, the way information was stored in the structure. Her expression, if I was reading it correctly, was recognition. The other pods took another 18 hours to fully open. They did it in sequence, the outermost ring first, then the next, and so on inward in a spiral pattern that I spent an hour watching before I recognized it as an organizational hierarchy, rank or status, or some other ordering principle. The outer pods holding beings who were large but clearly not the largest. The inner pods holding beings that seemed to be of a different configuration entirely, administrative or advisory in some way. The innermost pod did not open until the others were all open and settled. And by that time, I had been in the chamber for 20 hours straight, having eaten twice and not slept. And there were 46 beings of various configurations seated or standing around the chamber's perimeter regarding me, with the particular patient attention of people who had decided to wait and see. None of them had attempted to harm me. None had attempted to communicate in any way I could interpret. They watched me the way you watch something you haven't categorized yet, not with hostility, but with the careful attention of beings who understood that categorization was important. When the innermost pod opened, everyone's attention shifted to it, and I felt the attention of the room change the way air pressure changes before weather. She was different from the others in ways I would spend months trying to articulate. Larger, yes, but it wasn't the size that mattered. It was the way the other 46 oriented toward her the moment she emerged, not looking at her exactly, but adjusting their posture, their attention, their entire spatial presence in relation to hers. A field almost, a gravity. The one who had taken my paper crane was still holding it. She moved to the central figure and presented it. The central figure, the queen, I thought, though I was working entirely from intuition and the film of fiction that inevitably coats any human's attempts to interpret alien hierarchies, took the crane, looked at it for a long time, then looked at me. She was very still. The other 46 were very still. The ship was very still. She made the sound, the resonant exhalation, that the first one had made, but longer, layered, more frequencies than I had the hearing to distinguish, but I felt them in the floor. Then she crossed the chamber to me. I held my ground. I would like to report that this was courage, but it was actually the paralysis of someone who had reached the outer limit of their decision-making capacity and was simply waiting to see what happened next. She stopped 2 meters away, close enough that I could see the texture of her, the way her surface caught the warm light the ship was generating now, no longer the reddish emergency glow but something fuller and richer, the color of late afternoon. She was looking at me the way the glyph wall had looked at me when I'd first found it, dense with information, waiting for the question. She held out the paper crane. I reached out and took it. She made a sound then that I didn't have a framework for, a sequence of frequencies that moved up through a register I could hear and kept going into something I couldn't. But around me, the 46 were shifting, a ripple of movement, and some of them were making sounds of their own. Not alarm, something else. Something that, if I had heard it from humans in a different circumstance, I might have called. The queen turned away from me and addressed her people in their own language, and I understood nothing of it, and it didn't matter because whatever she said, the room changed again. The careful, watchful patience resolved into something more relaxed. The quality of the 46's attention toward me shifted from categorizing to simply present. I had been in the room with them for hours, and none of them had asked me to leave, and now they had stopped treating me like something to be assessed. The cooperative vessel arrived 3 hours later. When the liaison came aboard and found me in the central chamber, surrounded by 47 beings of a species entirely new to the registry, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall eating a ration bar, while the Queen held the paper crane, and her people moved through the restored corridors of their ship. He stopped in the doorway and said nothing for a full minute. "We have prepared diplomatic protocols," he said finally. "Good," I said. "They'll want to talk about the people who hit their ship." The full picture took weeks to piece together, and most of it came not from me, but from the diplomatic teams that the cooperative eventually deployed in sufficient numbers to make real translation work possible. What I understood, from the fragments that filtered back to me through official channels and through the less official channels of the engineers' network, the slow accumulation of second-hand information that is how field workers actually understand the world, was this. The species had no name we could pronounce. The cooperative assigned them a designation code. Everyone else called them, informally, the Akara, after a word in their language that appeared to mean something close to persisting. They had been spacefaring for longer than any species in the cooperative's registry, which itself said something significant. The Queen in the innermost pod was not a political figure in the way the cooperative generally understood political authority. She was something more like a seed bank, a repository, the continuation of something that could not afford to be interrupted. The ship had been struck in the outer reaches of their home system by a cooperative survey expedition that had misidentified it as a derelict navigational hazard and attempted to tow it out of a transit corridor. The survey team had not known there was anyone aboard. The Akara had been in deep stasis because the transit between their system and the cooperative's core space took decades at the speeds available to them, and you did not stay awake for decades if you didn't have to. The damage from the tow attempt had drained the power systems and started the long, slow drift. The survey team had filed a report. The report had sat in a queue. The queue was very long. There were protocols. 3 weeks of drifting, and but for a lone repair contractor with a kit bag and an engineering problem and a paper crane in her pocket, 47 of the Akara would have died somewhere in the dark between stars, and no one would have known they'd existed. The liaison came to find me a month after the diplomatic teams arrived. I was back on Vorta 9, which was something of an anticlimax, but the coolant loop wasn't going to repair itself. "They've asked for you," he said. "Me specifically." "You specifically, the Queen." He handed me a data packet. "She has requested a meeting. The diplomatic team is," he paused, somewhat flummoxed, frankly. "She will not begin formal negotiations until she has spoken with you." I wiped my hands on my work cloth and took the data packet. "What does she want to say?" He shook his head. "She says it needs to be said in person." The meeting was in a neutral facility on a cooperative transit hub, a clean, undistinguished space that looked like every other diplomatic meeting room I'd ever accidentally been adjacent to, which was not many. There were translators, 3 of them in a row, the cooperative's best linguistic technicians who had been working with the Akara for 3 weeks now. There was the liaison. There were 2 cooperative council members. There was me, in my best work coveralls, which were still obviously work coveralls. The Queen entered and the room reoriented. She was taller in this space than she had seemed on her own ship, or maybe it was just that the context was different, that the scale of her became apparent here rather than being absorbed into the scale of everything around her. She crossed the room to where I stood, because I was standing near the wall as a matter of habit and therefore separate from the official delegation. She held out the paper crane. I hadn't known she'd kept it. I stared at it for a moment. Then I looked up at her, and because there was nothing else to do, I said, "You kept it." One of the translators rendered this in whatever approximation they had developed of the Akara's frequency language. The Queen made a sound. The translator said, after a moment, "She says that it is a record of care. She says that you preserved her people and then gave her a record of care, and this is the custom of her people when meeting a stranger who may be trusted, to offer something that required attention to make, so that the stranger knows you understand that their attention has value. I looked at the paper crane in her hand. I looked at her face. I looked at the amber gold eyes that had regarded me from an open pod, with the particular patience of someone who had been thinking for a very long time. "Tell her," I said, "that my daughter taught me to make it." The translator rendered this. The queen was still for a moment. Then she made a sound I hadn't heard before, something complex and layered, and all three translators looked at each other before the one in the middle said, "She wants to know if your daughter knows what she did." I thought about that. I thought about a 6-year-old sitting on the kitchen floor, serious and intent, folding a sheet of paper with the gravity of someone sharing an important secret. I thought about how information is stored in the relationship between things. I thought about 47 pods in a ring of rings, a hierarchy arranged not by power, but by what needed to be preserved. "Not yet," I said, "she's 6. The translator rendered this. The queen made the layered sound again, and this time the translators did not confer. The middle one simply said, "She will know when she is older. The Akara will make sure of it." The formal diplomatic session began then, and I moved to the wall and watched, because it was not my session, and I was not a diplomat, and I had a coolant loop waiting for me on Vorta 9. But before I went back to my place at the edge of the room, the queen had already turned to me one more time. She set the paper crane on the table between us. Not giving it back, setting it down. Setting it in the space between us, the way you set something in a common space that belongs to both parties. I left it there. The negotiations took 7 months. I followed them from a distance. Repair contracts in sectors 8, 11, and 14, the slow accretion of jobs that had nothing to do with any of it, my workshop and my ship and the day-to-day work that I'd done before this and would keep doing after. I read the dispatches when they were public. I heard things through the network that weren't public. The Akara wanted to join the cooperative, not as petitioners, as equals. They brought something to the table that no one had anticipated, a knowledge of deep transit routes accumulated over a period of spaceflight that predated the cooperative's founding by centuries. Routes that avoided the transit hazards that currently cost the cooperative an estimated 8% of its total shipping volume in delays, detours, and damage. The cooperative wanted to be cautious. There were frameworks, there were protocols. The assessment panels met and expanded and met again. The queen waited. She was, by all accounts, very patient. She had been asleep for decades in a damaged ship. She understood that some processes moved at their own speed. The agreement was ratified 7 months after the negotiations began. The Akara became the 48th recognized species in the cooperative's registry, with full diplomatic status, active representation on the council, and a provision in the agreement, noted quietly in an appendix that most of the press coverage didn't mention, that in cases of derelict vessel assessment in Sector 14 and adjacent sectors, assessment contractors were to be briefed on the possibility of Akara sleeper vessels before beginning any work. I read that last part twice. I didn't know whether to be flattered or annoyed that it had taken the death near miss of 47 beings to produce that particular administrative update. Probably both. My comm blinked the day after the ratification. Not orange, not the standard white. A frequency I didn't recognize, from a source the system didn't have a file for. The message was a sound file, 20 seconds long. I played it 3 times before I understood what I was hearing, the same layered resonant sound the queen had made when I'd told her my daughter had taught me to make the crane. The translators had called it what they called it. I didn't have the translators now. But I'd spent a month in a room with 47 Akara while they were waking up, and some things don't require translation. The frequency, the layering, the way it rose at the end. It was a greeting, a recognition, A sound that said, "I see you. I know what you did. I remember." I sat at my workbench for a while, not working, just holding the comm with the sound file on it. Then I put it down and went back to the coolant loop, which had waited long enough. Outside the workshop window, the station traffic moved in its ordinary patterns. Ships arriving, ships departing, the usual commerce of living things moving through space. I watched it for a moment before I bent back to the work. 47 of them, I thought. 47 beings alive because a contractor with a kit bag and a paper crane, and no particular inclination toward heroism had decided, on a Tuesday, that the protocols could wait. My daughter would know when she was older. The Akara had said so, and the Akara, I was beginning to understand, did not say things they did not mean. I found that I was smiling. I went back to work.